We're going to go ahead and take a look at how to do a 3-point lighting setup inside of Maya. This video is going to build upon the previous two videos where we first created a turntable for our game prop and then built a backdrop for our game prop. For this video I'm going to go ahead and use the curved backdrop as opposed to the straight backdrop. And this is purely preference. There's nothing better or worse by using either or. There's several different ways that you can do a 3-point lighting setup. Sometimes that's actually done using spotlights. I'm going to show you a different method that involves using area lights for our setup here. There's a few things that we want to make sure of to begin with before we begin working on this. First thing that we're going to want to do is go into the render settings and make sure that we're indeed using Maya software. We want to set our quality from preview quality to production quality. The other thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we enable ray tracing, which is going to allow us to use a specific type of shadow effect. At this point we can go ahead and just also make sure that our size is still set to 720 by 405. At this point we're also going to do a couple of other things to prep our scene file. The first thing that we're going to want to do is for our backdrop in question, I want to go ahead and apply a custom material for that object. So for this I'm going to go ahead and right click and assign a new material. When the window pops up, I want to go ahead and just use a Lambert material. I don't need there to be any shine, which would be the reason to use a blend material or for reflectivity. So for now, I just want to use a Lambert for the backdrop. And in here we can go ahead and name our material. I'll just call this backdrop shader. You can also specify a different color if you're so inclined. I may actually give mine a little bit more of a grayish blue tint to the scene, just to get a little bit more of a contrast between the actual geometry of a scene and the backdrop. From there, what I want to do is select all of the geometry. So I'm going to go ahead and select everything here. Now currently it's using Lambert 2 material, but what I want to do instead is actually make this a blend material. So if you have already created a custom Lambert material, such as I've done here in this situation, you can actually just come into the attribute editor, highlight the tab for the material in question, and change its material type. In this case I want to change this from Lambert to blend. The only reason I want to do this is because this is going to allow for a specular highlight, which can be found right over here for the specular shading. By default, however, it also adds a reflectivity of basically 0.5, which is 50%. I want to turn that off, so that way it doesn't add to my render time for calculations. For your own specific models, you're going to want to texture the pieces of geometry using a similar method here, but just using base colors for your object. For this object, I'm just going to keep it at the default. Go ahead and let's start taking a look at creating a 3-point light. So when dealing with a 3-point light setup, the key thing to remember is that the 3 lights that you're going to have, one being the key light, which is the dominant light source. You're going to have a fill light, which is going to keep the dominant light source from being overly harsh, and you're also going to have what we call a backlight, sometimes also referred to as a rim light. The primary focus for the rim light is to give a bit of middle ground and background, or in this case foreground background separation between the objects, and it also allows for specific highlights on certain areas. So the first light that we're going to take a look at is going to be the key light, and as I said, we're going to create this using a slightly different method. You can use spotlights, but I prefer to use area lights as I like the effect that they're going to give. We'll go up to the Create menu, we'll go to Lights, and we'll create an area light. One of the things that I like about an area light is that you can shape this light around by scaling it. The size of the light as well as the intensity of the light are all going to play factors in how this light is going to look in our scene. So I'm going to hop out of my camera view, which I'm currently in my render cam. So I'll go over here to perspective view, and typically you want your light to be roughly at about a 90-degree angle from your camera. So I can see here that my camera is pointing in this direction. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to rotate the light along these lines here, and I'll place the light back here. I also want to make sure that the light is out of the way for my scene. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to scale up my light. And maybe just angle it downwards a little bit, so that way we can actually see the shadows being cast on the ground. That's our goal. So we'll cast it down about like that. Go back into the perspective, or the camera view, and just make sure that the light's not in the scene. So in this instance, what we'll do is we'll go ahead, we'll open up the render view window, and perform a render. Now if your render comes out in a different view, as you can see, maybe it says down here that you were rendering in the perspective view, just go up to the Render drop-down menu, go to Render, And make sure that you're rendering from render cam. So at this point, this is what I'm going to get, which is not a whole lot. By default, Maya has on a box over here, which is going to be, in this instance, going to be your color management. This is not something that is handled very well when inside of Maya when using the default renderer. It's really meant for more advanced renderers like Arnold, which we won't be using for these assignments. So for now, I want to turn that off. My intensity is too low, so I'm going to bring up the intensity to a value of 10. At this point, we start to see a little bit more, but it looks like I'm going to have to bump it up. The other problem that I'm going to need to address, which we'll go ahead and take care of right now, is if we go into the display render settings, underneath software, there is a section that we want to take a look at. It's underneath rendering options. So down here, we have what's called gamma correction. We want to make our lights a little bit brighter, and by default, this is set to a value of 1. So I'm going to change this to a value of 2.2. There's an actual mathematical formula that is driven which gives us this value, but this is going to basically make our scene a little bit brighter. So we'll go ahead, turn that up, and re-render. And now you can see that the scene is a lot brighter at this point. However, our shadow quality is a little bit to be desired. So let's go ahead and let's play around with the light settings a little bit more. I'm going to bring this up to a value of 30 and click on render again. So as we do this, our lighting is starting to get a little bit better, but you can see this side is going to be a lot harsher. Our shadows are also not the greatest at the moment either. So there's a few things that we will make some adjustments to. So the first thing is in the Shadows tab. If we scroll down here, you can see that we have two different types of maps. One is called DMAP or Depth Map Shadows, which is based on a resolution. The higher this value is, the better your shadow quality will be. However, it produces a little bit more of a softer shadow. Scrolling down a little bit further, your Ray Trace shadow attributes, which is what we're currently using by default, is going to give you a crisper shadow. However, you can see here we have a section here for shadow rays, which is currently set very, very low, which is why our shadows don't appear very well here. So if I were to up that value to, say, for instance, 8, this is going to make the render for the shadows look a little bit better, but the trade-off is going to be render time. So far, my renders are only taking about 3 seconds to render. So here's my new render. Took 12 seconds, but the quality looks so much better than it does before. So there's a few other adjustments that I want to make to this key light. First thing is we have a section down here called decay. In real life, light does not go on forever. It actually eventually ends based on the intensity of the light. CG lights are a little bit different. CG lights can technically go on for infinity. If you light something in one spot and you go to the far end of it, you're going to see the same lighting effect. To combat this, we have something here called decay rate, which basically allows the light to fall off. Once again, based on mathematical equations of how light affects atmosphere around us. The best method to go with is going to be quadratic. This is going to be the closest to real world lights. However, when you turn this on to quadratic and you come over here and re-render, what you're going to notice is your scene is going to go extremely dark. As you can see here, you can now pretty much see nothing, which means that you're going to have to up your intensity of what you thought you had proper. Now you have to make some adjustments. So in this case, I'm going to just basically add another 0 to take this from 30 to 300. At this point, it's starting to get a little bit lighter, but it's still just not quite enough. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this up even higher. We're getting there, but as you can see here, we may have to go a little bit more extreme. So I'll bring this up to a value of 2000 just to see what we get. So a little bit better. One other option that we do have is this checkbox right over here called normalize, which is the next thing I wanted to show you. With this checkbox, when you keep it normalized, the only thing that's going to be a factor in the light's intensity is going to actually be the intensity. When you uncheck this, the size of the light will also dictate the intensity of the light. So with this unchecked, with my light sized up, and with this intensity, let's see what our result's going to be. So at this point, it looks a lot brighter. And this is actually looking pretty decent here. Now, because of the intensity being what it is and the light fall off, I'm going to end up needing to adjust my shadow quality here just to get a little bit more of a better result. But I like where this is going. The other thing that I'd like to try to do is I'd actually like to try to give a little bit of color. Key lights tend to be a nice warm color, and I don't want to just use the basic white color that we have here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the color swatch, use the color wheel, and just start to give and introduce a little bit of a nice warm orange color. And go ahead and re-render. Now if you ever want to compare renders, there's this button right over here which is keep image. It basically just stores a snapshot of this image so that way we can look at it and compare it. At this point, this adds a nice little warm hint to our light. So I'm going to click on the Keep Image button so that way we can toggle back and forth between so that we can see the results of this. This might be just a bit too warm, so we'll go ahead and we'll just dial it back just a little bit. But otherwise, I'm really happy with the effect that I'm getting here. Now, the other thing that we can also do is if we need to, we can also play around with the actual shaders for our object here. So I'm going to just minimize the render view. Reason being is I'd like to just see how the intensity for the specular color is, and I might just bring that up just a little bit. And then we can also play around with what's called the specular roll-off and the eccentricity. These just dictate how wide the specular highlight is and how intense the specular highlight is, so we can make it something more of like a fine plastic, or we can bring it up a little bit higher, almost more of like a metallic sort of look. So I'm going to try something along these lines for right now. And we'll go ahead and we'll bring back the render view here. And let's go ahead and try re-rendering. So overall, I think we're getting pretty close to what I'd like with this. The only thing I'm not a big fan of is this sort of little hot spot that we have here. So I might move the light up and back just a little bit just to help out with the lighting. So to do that, I'll just go back into the perspective view. Just sort of take a look at where we've got this light. Now I may actually just make it a little bit larger. Maybe just pull it up and bring it up just a little bit higher and just angle it down. This is an iterative process, so you may find that the first time you go at this, you may not get the exact result that you're looking for, and that's okay. Okay, so I think I like that. I'm going to maintain holding off on adding any sort of shadow quality until the very end, until I'm ready to actually begin calling this my final render. So with that light in place, the next light that I want to take a look at is going to be the fill light. Now typically the fill light is placed at about a 180-degree angle, so it should be going in the opposite direction of the key light. Now here's the key thing though. Fill lights, along with rim lights, should not be casting any shadows. In a traditional CG environmental setup for a 3-point lighting, we don't want them casting shadows because that sort of draws the viewer's eyes away and makes it very difficult to understand where the main light source is coming from. So for that reason, what I'm going to do is just make sure that I disable shadows on the next two lights that I create. So we'll come back over into the perspective view. What I find it's easy is just to go ahead and make a copy of this light. But before I do that, let's go ahead and let's name it. And then we'll go ahead and duplicate it. At this point, if you hit the T key on the keyboard, you can actually take this key light, and it's got a target which we can just sort of position in this area here. And if you need to, we'll just switch back and forth between a couple different views. That way this light's always going to be looking at that location. And then we can just take this, we'll swing it around. And sometimes even a 90-degree angle from this will actually work as well too. And I think I'll try that for right now. But I do need to go into the perspective view because this is not going to work exactly where we have it. You can see here that this target needs to be brought up a little bit. Just that way it's looking in the right spot. And then of course we can take this light and just sort of bring it back. Now the other thing to also keep in mind is a twofold thing. The newly created light that we're going to go ahead and name as the fill light should not be as intense. So I'm going to dial this down maybe to about 1500. I'm also going to come down and disable shadows. So if I turn off the use ray trace shadows and the use depth map shadows are both turned off, this light will emit no shadows. It will emit for diffuse and specular, meaning it will light the scene as normal, as well as the specularity of it. I'd also like to give this a little bit more of a bluish color. So I'm going to go ahead and swing this around towards the blue spectrum in the color wheel. We can maybe try this sort of right here, but I think I want to go ahead and just angle this up just a little bit. We may just need to make it just a little bit smaller as well too. I just don't want there to be a hot spot in that section. So we'll go ahead and we'll go back into the render view. Now I can see that there's a little bit of the light visible here. This may not be an issue until we actually render it and see. So in this regard, the light is just way too intense here. So we need to dial this down. So I'm thinking maybe even to about 500 because we also dialed down the size of the light, which means the intensity and the light are going to both play together. And this is starting to look a little bit better, although it's still a little bit too bright. So one of the things that I may do is we'll just bring this down to maybe 250 and try again. And that's starting to look a lot nicer, although I think I could still bring this down maybe to 175. That's looking better. So the idea is that we still can tell where our dominant light source is based off of the lighting information that we're getting here, but now we're sort of filling in the backside so it's not completely dark. So we could even argue that this could be brought down even a bit more, but I think for right now, for this purpose of the demo, this is going to work just fine. So the last light that we want to create is our rim light, or our kicker light. It goes by a lot of different names. It's also sometimes called the backlight. So what I want to do in this regard is we'll go ahead and hop back into a perspective view. We can take one of the lights that we've created, which in this case I'll just take the fill light. We'll duplicate it. Let's rename it. Let's go ahead and just take and place it right behind our object. So in this case, it'd be easier if I just go ahead and type in 180 and 180, and let's just take the 0 value here for rotate Y. And we just want to set this light sort of right behind it. And what I'm going to do is just go into a front view just so that way I can just align this. And we can actually just take the translate X value and zero that out. So with that in place, I'm going to go ahead and scale this light up a little bit, and maybe even just bring it down just a little bit. So the idea is that we're trying to get a little bit of a rim light effect on this object. Now, in this regard, we might actually have to bring it up and angle it down a little bit. But let's try it right here for the time being. So what we'll do is we'll go back into the attribute editor for this object. This light typically is a white light. I don't normally color this light, so I'm going to go ahead and leave this as a non-colored light. We also want to make sure that we are not casting any shadows, so it's the reason why we took this light and duplicated it from the fill light, but we might have to up the intensity a little bit here. So we'll try this one at maybe 250, just to see what we get from this specific view. And it's also not normalized, so the size of this light's also going to dictate the intensity. We'll go ahead and hop back into the render cam, and let's give it a render. There's our starting point. It's okay, but still want to try to get some highlights on some of these areas that are around here. And this may be a little bit on the trickier side to do. For now, we'll just go ahead and we'll try to make a few adjustments. Now, the biggest problem is that this light is actually blocking out a lot of the shadow information that we have here. So there's actually a way that we can have this backlight illuminate just this object, but not illuminate the backdrop. And so the way that we can do this is through a method called light linking. And you can see here that this also causes this really harsh line here. Light linking is found by going up to the Windows menu, Relationship Editors, Light Linking, and we're going to choose this option called Light Centric. When this window pops up, you're going to see two panels over here. One is going to be your light sources, the other is going to be illuminated objects. So all I want to do is come over here and highlight where it says rim light, and then we're going to click on the plus sign if you happen to have a group here. And everything inside of this group is going to basically be illuminated. So if we come over here and just specify that we want only this object here to be illuminated and not this backdrop, this should help us out with getting that to not be illuminated in this regard. Let's go ahead and do another test render. Now you can see that our shadows are going to be back. We no longer have that harsh line that we saw here before. So now we're free to go in and try to make some adjustments to this object so that we can get the most ideal rim lighting scenario for our object here. So I'm going to go ahead and close out the window. I'm going to bring this and make it a little bit wider. And I think what I'm going to do is also take it, angle it up just slightly. I'm going to also go back into the perspective view just to make sure I'm happy with how far back this light is going to be. Go back into our render cam and do another test render. Now I'm starting to see a couple of rim light areas, especially on this side here. Now keep in mind this is only being done from a still frame, so you have to keep in mind that we're going to see this as this object turns and moves around. So sometimes some of the effects that we'll see may be beneficial, sometimes they may not be. So what I think I'm going to do is we're going to ease off of this lighting here just a little bit. I'll break it down to about 150. I think that'll also help sort of soften the overall look that we're getting on this. There we go. So I think that's looking a little bit better. With this object being sort of the way that it is, I may not be able to get the ideal specular highlights without actually having some more lights put into the scene. But for right now, I think for the sense of this demo, this is going to be okay. I can still see where my main light is coming from. And once again, I could also play around with a few of the settings here. So for instance, if I wanted to take my fill light, maybe bring this down to 100, take my key light, maybe bring this to 2250, and then of course leaving the rim light sort of where it is. Maybe we could even just start to bring this down. We might get a little bit better result. But the idea is that we're doing one light at a time, and we're making those adjustments before we add in another light, so that way we can see each of the individual lights effects as they're lighting. Yeah, I think I'm liking that. I think it's got a nice little effect. Now we might be getting a little bit of blowout going on over here, which means that once again, if we need to, we can always come back over here to our actual material here, and maybe just dial down the specularity just a little bit here. Bring that down. Maybe even just bring the specular highlights down just a little bit. All I'm doing is just selecting one piece of geometry that has that material. And I would probably want to call this game object shader or some sort of descriptive name so it's not just called blend1, so that way I can see what I'm working with here. Let's try one more test render. Yeah, I think that's going to work a little bit better here for the situation that I'm working on here. Now keep in mind, as I'm going through and doing this, I am pausing the video as I'm going through and doing the renders, so that way you don't have to watch the full time for it to render. And I'm also on a different machine, so your render times are going to vary based on the hardware that your computer currently has. So please do keep that in mind. My render times are not going to be your render times, because it also has to deal with the intensity of the model that you're trying to render and all of the detail components that have to get processed in this regard. But so far I'm kind of liking this. Now one final thing, if we wanted to try to get a little bit more of an even lighting scenario for the backdrop, what we could do is come into the perspective window and maybe just create one more area light. So if we come over here to create lights, create an area light. With this light, what I want to do is just size it up. I'm going to angle this a little bit, and I'm going to keep it kind of on the smaller side, or the more sort of rectangular side. I'm going to have it going sort of in this direction, and then once again, I think with this one, we're once again going to go ahead and put on a quadratic light, and maybe bring this up to, we'll try 800 for right now. We'll turn off the normalize, and also I want to go ahead and turn off ray trace shadows. Now with this light, the sole purpose for this light, I'm going to go ahead and call this my backdrop light, because all I wanted to do is help illuminate the backdrop. This light is purely optional. You don't have to do this if you're getting a decent result from your renders. But what I'm going to do is with this light selected, we'll go back up to Windows, Relationship Editors, Light Linking, and Light Centric. So with the backdrop light, I want to just go ahead and make sure that the only thing that's being illuminated here is just the curved backdrop. So that way it basically ignores everything else that we have going on for our lighting. And I just want to make sure it's high enough that we get the back illuminated here without losing the shadows of the detail from the key light that we have in here, which is why I'm trying to keep this light relatively low, and it's set to quadratic. But let's take a look and see what the result looks like. I think this actually adds a nice little extra touch to it. We could maybe bring it down to about 600. And maybe if need be, we could bump up the key light just a little bit more to make that shadow just a little bit more pronounced. But once again, these are some of the settings that you can go through and you can make adjustments as you see fit. So we'll try one more render. Yeah, I think it's looking a little bit better. So we're just trying to soften this up a little bit without losing the harshness of the shadows. That's the key thing. Now the last thing that I would do is if I was absolutely happy with this render, I would come over here to my key light. With it selected, going to bring this up to 2500. I'm going to come down here to my ray trace shadow settings and bump up my shadow rays. Now this value is going to be different because each lighting setup is going to be different. So the number that I use may not necessarily be the number that you're going to use. You're going to have to experiment with this until you find a value that you're going to absolutely be happy with. And for each of you, that may be different. So just keep that in mind as you're going through and doing that. Last thing I think I'll try doing here is maybe just bring this light up just a little bit. You can see I'm continually iterating on this. Yeah, I think that does a better job getting the light to cast on here. And the light shadow itself doesn't have to be overtly harsh. It can certainly be a little bit less, and this is where you can play around until you find just the right result that you're looking for. But you can see here that my shadow color is already set to black, so there's really not much that I need to do with that as far as what we're taking a look at here. But otherwise, I like the effect that's starting up here. Could definitely play around with it for a little bit more, right? We could tweak this for easily another half hour. But I think for right now, just to understand how to create a 3-point light setup, along with creating a potential backdrop light just to help give you a little bit more of an even lighting, is the main goal here. Last thing that I would mention is that before you are ready to start doing a batch render, you're just going to want to make sure that you're going over a couple of the base settings here. So since we've turned off color management, what you see here should be what you get, but you want to just make sure in a couple of areas that that option has basically been disabled. So as you can see here, there's no option to apply for color management here, but that would also be found right over here inside of the preferences settings button. And you'll find that there's a section here for color management. Now at the moment, it is technically enabled. So if you wanted to have your look very similar to what you see here, you may just need to disable this color management. So that way, what you see here in your render is actually what you're going to get when the time comes for you to batch render. So if I go ahead and I turn this off and I do another re-render, this is what our result's going to be. So this is how you can create a 3-point lighting setup inside of Maya.